So today we'll start the section on Plato, discussing Plato. We'll just introduce Plato, and we won't really be able to do Plato justice either, in for sure in one lecture, much less a whole course. So anybody who's interested in philosophy, I highly encourage to read Plato's dialogues yourself. Any summary of what he means to say in any dialogue that he had written will necessarily be a kind of um, oversimplification, you might say, maybe in that sense a misrepresentation, because the dialogue usually has so many dimensions, and oftentimes uh, the effect is to raise certain kind of questions uh, more than it is to specifically lay down any kind of philosophical propositions, although there are those. So what we're going to do here is just um, introduce some of those that one might find or would find if you're reading the dialogue called Meno, right? Um, at least understood in the uh, roughly understood against the backdrop of what's known or what's understood to be Platonic philosophy historically on the basis of the history of people reading Plato and interpreting Plato. But the Platonic dialogues really, in my opinion, are quite a work of literary genius, because I do think they take the reader on a sort of a journey, let's say, that you could only really go on by reading it yourself. And so, yeah, again, that's why for anyone really interested in philosophy, I really recommend reading the dialogues themselves. Not necessarily all of them, but in today's lecture will be focused on Meno. So, um, yes, I recommend everybody who's really interested in it try to read the Meno as a whole for themselves. But at the least, for the purpose of this class, read the sections of Plato which are provided in the book. These are just excerpts from some of the dialogues. An excerpt from Meno is in there, as well as an excerpt of the Symposium and a famous part from a dialogue called the Republic. So this lecture is meant to be, at the very least, just something which is supplemental to that reading and supplemental to the process of reflection you would hopefully have gone through on the basis of that reading. Yeah, and we'll also try to see how this relates to the context of pre-Socratic philosophy that we discussed earlier in earlier lectures, and we'll see how some of the problems that were how Plato is responding to some of the questions and problems that arose among those previous thinkers. Okay, so let's start then. in Meno, Plato describes Socrates as actually in a conversation with the person named Meno. That's why the dialogue is named Meno. And the question that they are asking is, what is virtue, right? Maybe in Arabic we could translate this concept into ihsan, or in Greek it's arete. I think you've probably heard of this idea of this sort of human ideal in ancient Greek culture. In any case, it's the notion of a kind of a human ideal, what it is good for the human being to be, or what is it good for anything to be, right? Um, and the question is obviously something important. People want to know how they can learn to be better, right? And whatever way they conceive that. So Meno is asking that. What is virtue? And whether it can be taught whether it's just something known naturally, or whether it is, the third option is whether it is a gift, a divine gift from the gods, that you can only receive it through sort of divine intervention. hmm Um, but the specific problem, and there's so many different thoughts and let's say topics that the Meno raises, right, or potentially raises for the reader. But the main thing we're going to focus on is what people have classically focused on in Meno, is the problem of what is learning and how learning is possible, right? So stemming from the question, what is virtue, whether it can be taught, right? Whether it's something that is known naturally, or whether it requires divine intervention. The underlying question is whether it's possible to learn how to be virtuous, right? And so that leads to a problem about learning itself, and a problem about what knowledge is, or what it is to gain knowledge. More clearly, the question is um, whether gaining knowledge is possible, whether learning is possible, and if so, what must knowledge be, right? And how we must conceive learning. So the problem that Meno brings forward, we could articulate it in this way. This is not the exact words of the dialogue, but this is a way we could boil it down. Yeah. Um, so if we start with this premise that we either know what virtue is, or we do not know what it is, right? Uh, then we end up with this dilemma, right? If we know what it is, then we don't need to find it out. And basically, if we already know what it is, we can't learn it, because learning is to find out something you did not already know, right? And if we do not know what it is, then there's no way to know whether we've actually learned it or not, whether we really have found it, right? And so uh, it looks like if these are our choices, then learning must be impossible. Yeah? Okay. So Socrates is, we might say, unusually decisive for uh, for Socrates. Say he's unusually decisive here in relation to the way he's portrayed in most of the other dialogues. He's more, he's unusually decisive on this point, that he wants to oppose anyone who says by this argument that learning is impossible. He thinks this is a kind of a sophistry. But really, he takes it quite seriously, as we're going to see. He does an experiment. He claims it's an experiment that's going to show us how learning happens. So Meno happens to have with him a servant or a slave boy who has not been to school, right? Only has basic knowledge, has never been educated in geometry, as Socrates verifies through the conversation, and so that he will know whether or not this person is a suitable guinea pig or test subject for this experiment, right? Okay, so he proceeds to have this conversation with the slave, and he draws on the sand this shape here, as you see, square divided equally into four internal squares there, right? And asks the slave whether he can draw the same shape exactly twice as large, right? And apparently the slave does have some basic knowledge of his multiplication tables and knows that 2 times 2 is 4, right? So he says, yeah, it's easy. We draw one with 4 squares across and 4 squares down, right? And we have a square that's this size, right? Let's say 2 units across, 2 units down. And since twice of 2 is 4, to make another shape with twice the area, it should be 4 squares across and 4 squares down, right? It sort of makes sense initially, right? And so Socrates then draws the shape as directed by the slave, and the slave says, yes, that's how to do it. And Socrates then asks, well, how many squares are there in this new shape? And the answer, of course, is 16. So is 16 twice as many as 4? Well, oops, obviously we made a mistake. 16 is a lot more than that, and we have actually a size of a shape that's much larger than what we were aiming to produce. So we go back. Socrates asks how many squares were in our original shape, right? 4. So the question is, if our new shape is going to be twice as big, how many squares must be in it? And the answer is 8, right? Not 16. So Socrates then asks, if we draw a line diagonally through our first shape, what have we done? And certainly we have divided it in half, right? And what is half of 4? Well, 2. So how many squares are on each side? 2. And you can see that there, right? Okay. We're all very visual, right? We more difficult to do this in your head without these pictures. For sure, I know that it would be more difficult for me, or almost impossible. I'm not very a mathematically minded person. And so for that reason, Plato would say, I have no business being in philosophy. And he might be right. In any case, the question now is, how many squares do we need in our new shape? And, the answer is 8. What is 8 divided by 2? It's 4. So how many triangles like this do we need to equal 8 squares? And he answers 4. Can you arrange these triangles into a square? Socrates asks. And the slave does it like this, right? And then the question is, and how long is each side of this shape? And the answer is that each side of this shape is as long as the diagonal line we drew across the first shape, right? So then he's discovered that to make a shape exactly twice the size and area, you would make one the sides of which are equal to the diagonal line drawn across the first one, right? Which is a geometrical theorem, right? So now Socrates can draw him a new square, let's say that square that he drew first with 16 units, and you can ask him, whether he can make another square exactly twice as large as this one, and the answer, of course, is easy. Now he knows, right? The sides of the new square should be equal to the diagonal drawn across this first one. So whichever sort of shape or size of square whichever size of square Socrates presents to him, that slave will be able to produce another one twice as large through this simple theorem, basically, that he's discovered, right? Now we say that he's discovered, and that's because Socrates did not tell him the answer, right? That's Socrates' main point here. He says, notice that I only asked him questions, and I did not tell him the answer. I only put him through a process whereby I posed him a series of questions, right? And never did I bring this knowledge into his mind, right? Rather, that knowledge, somehow he arrived at it. So we have to ask, what was that process, right? Well, Socrates wants to claim that the answer was already in his mind, right? Because if Socrates did not put the answer in, then it must have been there already. For how did it get in there, right? And so we have to look at this process in more detail. And it looks like this is what happened. We could describe it in this way. First, the slave thought he knew something that he did not really know, right? He thought he knew something that he did not really know. He thought he knew how to make the square twice as large, but unbeknownst to him at the time, apparently, unbeknownst to him, he was wrong, right? He didn't really know how to do it, even though I thought he knew. And then he realized that he did not really know what he thought he knew. That was when he tried to draw the square, and it turned out to be, because it was 16 units large, he realized that it was much larger than he was aiming to produce, right? And then he realized that he really already did know, right? But somehow did not know that he knew. And this is the key part, the puzzling part. Socrates wants to tell us that this person already knew the answer to the problem, right? And did not actually come to know it, but only came to realize that he knew it, where previously he did not know that he knew it, right? Uh, so first he thought he knew something that he did not really know. Then he realized that he did not really know what he thought he knew. And then finally he realized that he really already knew, but somehow did not know that he knew. Well, how can we understand that in any way that makes sense? Well, the one way to go about this is to ask whether or not it's the case that you've ever met somebody out in public who you thought you knew who they were, but you were mistaken about who they were, right? But it wasn't a total stranger. It is somebody who you did know, but you forgot, right? You forgot who they were. And since you had forgotten who they were, you mistook them from someone else. And then only after that you realized, oh, no, they were that, so it was George from 5 years ago. It wasn't the guy down the street, right, who I just met. They look similar, but actually. So in this case, right, you remembered, right, and what you had forgotten. And you can't remember what you did not already know, right? So the idea here then is to say something like, right, learning is remembering. Yeah. So realizing something that you did, realizing that you know something that you did not know you knew, is essentially what remembering is, right? Um, remembering is remembering something you had forgotten, right? Okay. Looks like we have a question. That's right, Sarah. That's a good way to put it. She's saying, so is learning in the eyes of Socrates just removing dust off of information already there? Yeah, that's one way to put it. He wants to say that learning is already remembering. Yeah. Learning is remembering what you already knew. Mm-hmm. So we were born with the knowledge. Well, the answer will be yes, but then with the caveat, as actually the question is, what is knowledge and what can be known, as we'll see, right? Um, Certainly, it doesn't seem plausible, Sarah, that I've always already known that your name was Sarah Theab, right? And that I was born with that knowledge or existed with that knowledge from eternity. Yeah? No, that doesn't seem to be right. But that leads to the question of exactly what is knowledge and what kind of thing can be known, which we'll get to shortly. Okay. Right. So let's just keep it there. We have it in big font here. Supposedly a big font is supposed to mean something. I don't know. I thought it did at the time. So that's why I put it this way. Learning is remembering what you already know, right? Maybe I put it in big font because that seems like it should be surprising, which it does seem to be, yeah? Learning is remembering what you already know. Yeah, so how can it possibly be the case? Mm-hmm. Right? Because as Sarah pointed out, it does seem to entail that everything we can ever know, we already know. Yeah? How can this be? Right? If learning is always remembering, then you can never come to know something that you did not already know. And that means that everything you can know, you already know. And it's just a process of realizing that you know it, right? Remembering it, in fact, yeah. Uh, that's all that learning is on this model. Mm-hmm. Okay. How can it be the case? Well, this is what it boils down to. Knowledge is of the real, right? That makes sense. It doesn't seem like you know something that's not true, and you can only know something if it's true, and it can only be true if it's real. Yeah. So let's just start with that intuition. Knowledge is of the real, and therefore, if something is not real, then it cannot be known. Yeah. So let's go back to recall what we learned from the pre-Socratic philosophers. And we really had, part of that was this sort of seeming antithesis between Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? Heraclitus told us that everything we experience is constantly changing, right? And that nothing remains constant at all other than change, yeah? And Parmenides basically says that change is impossible, right? Because if something changes, then it both is and is not, right? And nothing can both be and not be. It's either one or the other. Remember, that was his guiding principle, right? Nothing is not a thing. What is, and what is not, right? And so, because of the fact that if something, the concept of something changes, according to Parmenides' argument, entails that it be what it's not, right? Then change is impossible. Right. So Plato is, we can say, highly influenced by these two insights, right? And we can characterize Plato as holding that what changes neither is nor is not, but is always in between the two, right? So there is an actual third sort of in between being and non-being, and that is basically the realm, let's say, of that which changes, right? Because again, right, if something does change, it does seem to be in the case of Heraclitus, if everything was just change, right, then there wouldn't be any things that change, yeah? And that poses a kind of a problem because we think that change is something that happens to a thing. Things change, right? But if there are no things, then there's nothing to change, right? So if everything changes, as Heraclitus seems to propose, then nothing changes because there are no things to actually change, yeah? Um, so the thing that does change seems to actually be in this in-between state in spite of Parmenides' rule, right? But as a result, it can't really be known. I mean, so this is why Parmenides thought that change is impossible, because you can't think uh, that which is sort of in this in between, right? We can't think that which neither is or nor is not, or both is and is not, right? This kind of thing isn't logical, and it's not intelligible. And Plato will basically say exactly, and that's why the world, or let's say the realm of things that we experience with our senses, right? The world that we observe around us, which is, as Heraclitus points out, constantly changing, is actually not completely intelligible. It's not something that can be known, right? It's not something that can ultimately be known, right? The only sense in which we can know the things around us which are changing is by grasping that dimension of them that does not change, which is not something that we experience, because whatever we experience is constantly changing. Okay. Right. So this is repeating what I had said a bit. What is changing is neither being nor not being, but always becoming. Yeah, that's what we'll call it. It's becoming. It's becoming something else, right? But only that which is can be known. So the world that we experience with our senses cannot be known. What can be known is that which does not change. That is, that which is not always becoming something else, but always is what it is. And it's never, not what it is. Okay? So there are, for Plato, differences here between things. We can think of some examples, right? Let's say that you have a dream, and in your dream, you see a dragon, right? So, and you report your dream to us. We might ask you, did you really see a dragon or not? Isn't this question answerable by yes and no? Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes, it's a.
You were just asking about the dragon.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could see it, so it's there. Yes.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's real.
Okay. So it's a dragon, but
But
it's not a dragon, is it?
what is it then?
Well,
It's not a dragon, but it's a dragon. It's
a
not there, but
it's a
you
dream of
saw
a
one.
it's a dream of a dragon, right?
Yeah.
Or let's say that my daughter likes to draw. She's 6, right? So she'll draw pictures a lot. She draws a dragon, yeah. And I have 2 smart ass teenage kids, right? So she comes and says, "Look, it's a dragon," and one says, "No, it's not." She'll get mad. "Yes, it is." "No, it's not. It's a picture of a dragon." Yeah. Well, this is a smart ass teenager that would say something like that, right? But would he be wrong? No, he wouldn't be wrong because it's not a dragon. It's a picture of a dragon, right? So it sort of is a dragon, but it's not a dragon, right? We have something here that both is and is not, right? Sort of in between, the in between that Parmenides has a problem with. Yeah. Similar, I think, too. Like, yeah, the same with whether you're dreaming you're a dragon. Take a photo of yourself, post it, and someone could actually say, "That's not you, that's just a picture of you," right? The real you is not that picture, but yet the picture is you in a different sense, right? Mm-hmm. So ultimately, what Plato wants to say is um, the relation between this kind of image of a thing, let's say if it's a dream of a dragon or a picture of a dragon or a photo of yourself that you post or whatever, the relation between the image and the thing in our experience uh, is similar to the relation between what we experience and what actually is real, right? So if I were actually to see a dragon, yeah, there's a sense in which that actual dragon, or let's say that person that we see who posted a photo of themselves, right, is um, sort of deficient in reality, right, in being what it is or he or she is, in the same way that the photo is deficient in reality and not really being the person. Yeah. And that is because, again, because of the change. Yeah. Uh, I put a worm, I'm going fishing, I got a can of worms. I can put a worm on the hook, or even before I put the worm on the hook, somebody says, "What's in your can?" And, I could say it's the fish bait, right? It's fish food, right? And, well, it's not, it's worms, right? But, and then, yeah, in a certain sense, it's also fish food, and it's just about to become fish food, right? And everything that we experience in the world is sort of on its way out of from being what it is to being something else. Yeah. Um, and so for that reason, uh, Plato is concluding that it's not really knowable. And what is knowable in this case, right, would only be here, let's say, the concept of what it is to be fish food, right? Or the concept of what it is to be a worm. But the actual physical thing there that we experience, which is supposedly a worm or fish food, is always sort of, and this sort of in between. It's kind of ambiguous, right? Indecisive. It's always on its way to becoming something else. Yeah. Um, that's the idea. Okay. And the other comparisons, the comparison between a dream dragon and a, imagined real dragon. Okay, Sarah, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. I have a question.
Okay.
So initially you were talking about knowledge and what it is.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? Like, what it meant to know something, or like, how, can we actually learn anything?
Right.
And I feel like I lost the connection between that and what we're talking about now. Like, I understood your example, but I feel like I can't tie it back to the knowledge. So, are they done with that question? Is this a different question now?
It's totally
a completely different question about reality?
It's totally connected because the connection is there in the first premise. Knowledge is of the real.
Oh, okay. There you go. Okay,
Knowledge is of the real,
okay.
Right? Knowledge is not of that which is not real. Knowledge is of what is. So to know something is to know what is as it is. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if there is something which never is what it is, then it can't be known. Or
Okay.
we can maybe put it in a different, like a little bit easier. Let's say that it can only be known to the extent that it is what it is. Right?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's say if another one. So you're a pharmacy student, right? Is correct, yeah?
Yes, I'm a pharmacy student.
Right. I'm just verifying that for the purpose of the example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there could be somebody who's sort of interested in pharmacy and, hasn't really declared the major yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because they're undecided. But they're
Yes.
taking pharmacy classes. Yeah. So somebody could ask her whether she's a pharmacy student, right? Or let's say somebody asks the advisor or the pharmacy professor whether so and so is a pharmacy student, but that person hasn't decided yet, right? Then they would have to say they don't know, right? Because it seems like the person is in this kind of in between state of indecisiveness. Even they don't know whether they're a pharmacy student or not, right?
Yeah.
So there doesn't seem to actually be a fact there, clear fact as to whether they are or they're not. Yeah. So seems to be a difference then between, here we can't really say that they either are or not, but it seems as if we have a case where one person can be described as more decisively or more fully a pharmacy student than another who's kind of not quite a pharmacy student. Maybe they're just about to change their major. They're thinking about changing their major, right?
Yeah.
Because they got sick of it or something like that. Well, we have one student who's completely committed to pharmacy and they're really into it. And another one, they only kind of did it because their parents, told them that's what they want to do or whatever. Yeah?
Uh-huh.
And we really could say that one is more fully, right? He's the real pharmacy student. The other one is kind of not, wishy-washy. You see what I mean? So we can already understand and we talk about things in this way, right? And the connection between knowledge is this, knowing, knowledge is of the real. We would describe a person who really is committed to being a pharmacy student and therefore who really is a pharmacy student also as somebody who really knows what they want, who really knows who they are in this case, right?
Right.
So the connection there is because knowledge is of the real, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Likewise, if you
Yes.
have a dream of a dragon, you wouldn't really know that you saw a dragon, right? Yeah? You're waking up from your
Yeah.
dream and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared. Wait, did I really see a dragon? You see what I mean? So you don't really know if you saw a dragon, because if you were only dreaming, you would go, oh, I didn't really see a dragon. It was only a dream. And then you would say, oh, wait, well, okay, I did see a dragon in my dream, right? But I didn't really see a dragon. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Now go back to
Yes.
the little bit he did with the slave, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For Plato, he's saying, there's a geometrical sort of fact, right, about the relation between the diameter, or the diagonal of a square and the side of a square, right? And this is an idea, right? So when he draws the picture in the sand with the 4 units, and then shows the slave this picture, and then has the slave rearrange it in that one instance, yeah,
Yeah.
then the slave is actually knowing the relation between the side of the square and the diameter of the square with respect to that particular square which he observes in front of him, right?
Okay.
And then the idea here is that when he reaches this stage where he can perform the same kind of geometrical operation on any number of other squares that Socrates might draw in the sand, regardless of what size they are or how many units they consist in, he has reached a kind of different level. He's actually grasped the abstract reality of the square. Yeah? So
Okay.
the idea here for Plato, and generally for Platonism, is that the relation between the square which the slave sees right there in front of him on the ground and drawn in sand, to that abstract idea of square, right, is analogous to the relation between a dragon that you dream of and a dragon that you see. You see what I mean?
Kind of.
The dragon that you dream of is real in your dream, right? But it's not as real. It's not really a dragon. It sort of is and is not. Yeah? Okay?
Okay.
So likewise, the dragon that if you were to experience a dragon, right?
Experience a dragon.
You
Yeah.
see it in front of you, or let's say you dream of a horse. That's better than a dragon, right?
It's
You
more
dream of a
realistic.
horse.
Yeah.
You dream you're riding a horse. Now, a horse is something that you actually could, observe, right?
Actually
Because they
see
exist.
and ride.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Experience.
You could experience a horse. So a horse that you experience is less real, right, than the actual reality of a horse. In this certain,
Mm-hmm.
in a way which is analogous to the way that a dream horse is less real than the horse you experience,
Uh-huh.
right? And for Plato, it's because the horse, the real horse, right? It's always changing, right? It was born, and it's what I mean. It's always going through a process, like Heraclitus just pointed out, and Plato's basically agreeing that, right? Any specific horse that you experience is on its way to becoming, you know, um, worm food, I guess, right? And it's in the process of coming from something else. It was born before it was, like other things, and it became a horse from, being like a fetus, and right, being
Being
blood
yours.
and other kind of, uh,
Right.
materials, right? So
Mm-hmm.
uh, this means that the thing that we experience is always in this process. It is a process, like Heraclitus, you discussed. And remember, Heraclitus said everything is a process. Everything changes according to the measures. Well, what are these measures? Okay, so Plato's saying, yeah, these measures, right? This order, there's a sort of formal structure to this order, and that is actually the reality. That is what is, thoroughly, that's what always is what it is, and that is the thing that can be the actual object of knowledge. Yeah?
Uh-huh.
We
Yep.
can't actually really know truly the specific horse that we experience because it's always in a state of change. Anything that we kind of ascertain about it is going to be in some sense wrong. Yeah. Let's say that you could grasp every detail of the specific horse that you experience, right? Well,
Okay.
within that time, let's say some bodily changes are going on in the horse, right? And the blood is flowing through its veins, and particles are coming off of its body, and other particles are being incorporated into its body. You see what I'm saying? It's
Uh-huh.
eating and defecating, and right, cells, hairs are falling off all the time. So if you were to try to imagine a complete 100% detailed concept of every sort of minute microscopic detail of this horse, right? Whatever
Okay.
model that you would have in your mind would immediately not be the actual horse because it would change in some way, right?
What
Okay.
about non-living things, like a rock, for example?
Even rocks are changing. Everything that we experience is changing. The only example I just give examples because we're having an example of a living thing. But the
Mm-hmm.
but the premise here is that everything is changing. Organic or inorganic doesn't matter. I mean, you can take a rock and you can break it into little pieces. If a rock were
Right.
such as you're thinking that it always is what it is, it could never be broken, right? You pick it up and slam it down, and no pieces could come off of it. Not even in the minutest change could happen to it. Yeah, it would be something which is absolutely eternal, impervious to any kind of change at all. And nothing that we experience is like that, according to this idea. And so, therefore, nothing that we can experience can actually be known, right? We can know what it is to be a rock. We can know what it is to be a horse because this is a kind of an abstract idea which constitutes that measure that Heraclitus was talking about, right? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So we have a bunch of stuff out here that's changing. Like, think maybe it's water, maybe it's elements, maybe it's seeds, maybe it's atoms. It doesn't matter in this case, but all these things are changing. What Plato's doing here is trying to answer the question that the atomists could not answer when they try to reduce everything to atoms. Here's this clump of atoms, but what is it that makes this clump of atoms a horse, right? Well,
Yes.
Heraclitus provided part of that answer by saying, well, things change according to the measures. So there must be a measure of horse, right? Some standard which would what I mean, what it is to be a horse that determines that when atoms sort of clump together in such and such a way, we get a horse. That must be that entails there must be some kind of criteria for being a horse, right?
Right.
And that
So
must
when
be
you see a
something.
tree,
Mm-hmm.
you know it's a tree.
Exactly, or it's a dragon or whatever, right? Or a rock.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are the measures, right? I mean, this is, I think, what Plato's taking from Heraclitus, right? And he's also taken from Parmenides that, well, we can only really know it or think it if it, is what it is, right? So, uh, and so we get this sort of gradation of being, gradation of reality. So we have that which actually is what it is, and then sort of on a descending scale, things that are sort of more real down to less real. Yeah. The horse that you experience is more truly a horse than the horse that you dream, but it's not the actual ultimate reality of horse. That reality is abstract and not something experienced but only grasped with the intellect. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what we are talking, and this is the exact question that you asked. What does this have to do with knowledge? Well, to say that knowledge is of the real means that we tie or connect the epistemological to the ontological, right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and the Greek word for knowledge was episteme, right? Specifically, this idea of knowledge which is of the real, yeah, um, right? If you're a pharmacy major and maybe somebody else is a literature major, right? English literature. And you could imagine the parents of the English literature, or you could imagine the parents of the philosophy student also, right? Asking, why don't you study something real? Yeah? you have, this isn't, what I mean? So they might actually think that pharmacy is real knowledge, whereas somebody who knows what happens in the Shakespeare plays, yeah, that's not real knowledge, right? Because that's just a made up story. And so real knowledge is about the real world. And if it's about sort of, fiction, then how is that really knowledge? Because it's about something made up. It's just information about a story, but that's not really knowledge, right? Mm-hmm.
So
And
according to this theory, that wouldn't be knowledge because it's fiction.
yeah, well, it would be information about a fictional story. Now, what the response for many English for many literature people would be is to say, hey, look, this isn't really just fiction because it sort of carries or expresses real truths. You see what I mean? So it's a
Ah,
made up
okay, yes.
story, but the story is sort of expresses, or yeah, you know how that goes.
Like it
So
has a moral to it, and that moral is real.
and that moral is real and true. So to sort of boil down and sort
Okay.
of extract that moral from the story, the fictional story is merely a vehicle by which to communicate this truth. Yeah. And likewise, that's going on here, right? The things that you experience around you are, in a certain sense, vehicles to communicate abstract truth. If you wanted to say that the horses that you see in the field are metaphors, right, for
Yeah.
for the reality of horse, yeah, in the same
Uh-huh.
way that the horse that you dream might be a metaphor for something, or you can say it's just a reflection of the actual horse that you experience. Kid have it.
Mm.
The parents take the kid to the farm and he sees horses for the first time, and then that night he has a dream of a horse, and his parents, he tells his parents, and they say, "Oh, it's because we took you. You saw horses the day before at the farm, right?"
Right. Uh-huh.
So the horse that he experienced is the cause. The effect is the dream. The dream of the horse is the effect of that. The effect is less real than the cause, but gets the reality that it does have from the cause, right? And
Okay.
so there's that relation of the more real and the less real, right? But for Plato, the things that we experience aren't the ultimate reality. They are a reflection of abstract reality, in the same way that, right, the things you dream are
What
reflections
about
of what you experience.
what about like friendship or like loyalty or like these different sort of things that aren't like necessarily materialistic.
Right.
So they are abstract concepts, but like they're real, right? Like you can have friends, you can have
That's right.
I don't know, you can tell
Hmm.
the truth or you can lie, etc.
Right. So there should be a reality of friendship, and a reality of loyalty, and a reality of justice. And
Yes.
in this case, in the Meno, the question is virtue, right? A reality of virtue.
Ah, the first question, the very first question.
That's the question they start out with, right? Yeah, and
Right.
so in that case, it's the same. Plato wants to know the definition. Well, basically, to know what virtue is would be to know the definition of virtue in such a way that by knowing that definition, you would be able to ascertain for anything that you experience in life whether it's virtuous or whether it's not virtuous,
Uh-huh.
right? If that were not the reality of virtue, that abstract idea, then it wouldn't be possible to actually know when you experience one thing or another, like situations or people acting in a certain way, whether it's virtuous or not virtuous. You would have to have a list of things. You see what I mean? A list of things, and you'd have to go by this huge long list, which would be impossible. Exactly like if you were to want to know whether something is a horse or not, you need to know what a horse is first, and then from that, you can decide whether or not any animal that you observe is a horse. If you didn't start with that abstract knowledge or definition of what a horse is, you would have to have a list. Oh, this animal is a horse, but that's not a horse, and this is a horse, and that you'd have to go and put little signs on every animal in the world, right? With the name of what
Yeah,
it
so
is.
does that imply that we are born with the knowledge of what is virtuous? So we know what's like we know what's real virtue, and we know what's like actually good. versus what's like bad. So we just know already.
Right. Yep. Yep. So it means that you're born. It would mean that you always already know what virtue is, even if you have forgotten what it is, right? Yeah, and you may need to remember, right? And so the things that you experience can help you to recall, right? They can. That's the sort of that's another big question. That how does this happen? And that's we won't. That's something for Plato to talk about, in which he does talk about in many other ways in other places. But this question of how it is that something can jog your memory, so to speak, and awaken that knowledge which is inside you, which you aren't aware of and which you have forgotten. Yeah, but but the but importantly though, you see, the knowledge of what virtue is different than the knowledge of whether this or that person is virtuous. You see?
Yes. Okay.
So the question
Yes.
whether a
Okay.
specific person that you experience, a particular person is virtuous or not, is not really something that can be known, because that's in that lower level of things that are constantly subject to change. You see? A person might be virtuous in one situation and then they act viciously in a different situation, right?
Because they forgot what virtue was.
No, just because no, because I mean, they might not know what virtue is and act virtuously. So this is a different thing. Yeah, maybe
Okay,
it's
yes.
possible. Plato will actually say nobody can actually know the good without doing the good, right? But that's a separate question, right? What we're talking about now is the ontological side of it, whether they are virtuous or not. The question is never going to be decisively answered one way or another in the case of a specific person or particular person, because again, the particular is constantly subject to change. Okay? And secondly, it might be the case that in any situation, a person could only act in degrees of virtue, right? So it may be that the situation doesn't allow the person to act perfectly virtuous. Maybe no real life situation allows us to act perfectly virtuous, right? Because that's sort of the imperfection of the natural world. Yeah, you try to do some good for somebody, maybe that always entails that somehow or another, in spite of your intentions, you'll end up doing something bad for someone else, right?
Okay.
We always have in this sort of level of reality a kind of a level of relativism, right? I mean, and
right, yeah.
so multiplicity, right? There are multiple sort of points of view and multiple interests, and when things get multiple like that, uh, perhaps, perhaps these uh, abstract realities aren't fully realizable, right? But and then some people might say, well, in that case, those ideals aren't really fully real because they can't be fully realized in sort of a material life. But Plato's answer is the opposite: is to say, well, that just shows that material life isn't fully real. That is because material life isn't fully real, right? The fact that material life can never actually fully, be what it is, right? Is the actual indication, right? It proves that it's not fully real. That's what it is not to be fully real. Whereas these abstract ideals that we can never, maybe, possibly, probably we can't, ever fully realize in material life, those are actually the reality. Yeah. So knowledge is knowledge of those things, right? Um, and anyway, that's how this works with this relation between epistemology and ontology. So we have sort of different degrees of, we could say, degrees of knowledge. Plato distinguishes between knowledge and opinion, as we'll see, right? Knowledge is different than opinion, and for him, the only thing that you can have in about the material world is at best right opinion. Yeah? But you couldn't really have knowledge about the material world. The knowledge is only of the ideal. The ideas that give shape and form and reality to material things to the extent that they have them, and which I think Heraclitus sort of foreshadowed when he talked about the measures, things changing according to the measures, right?